All right, guys, welcome back to Exotic Car Hacks. And in today's video, there has been a lot of talk on the internet with a lot of young people buying exotic cars and the next 50 people calling them out for using specialty leases or weird types of, creative financing programs. But it brings us to this more relevant question now. Should you finance your exotic or should you be paying cash? Now, I want to context this because I've done a series of videos talking about the different finance, lease, and rental opportunities that exist in the market that people, especially young people who don't have a history of exotic car ownership and perhaps don't have a history of income suddenly come into some money, regardless that is crypto or something they're doing on the internet. How are they buying $2 million cars when no one else would give a normal person a loan? So we've done that video. We'll link it in the description for you if you want to go watch that. But this is a very different type of question because what happens is whenever these people, especially the Miami or LA people, come out and buy these new cars, there's a bunch of influencers who come and defend them, who go, well, listen, so what if they're financing cars? You got to put the money back in your business and you're an idiot if you finance a car and blah, blah, blah. Now, I'm the godfather of this, so I'm going to go back and give you some background about this if you're just new to the channel understanding this. So 20 years ago, I started collecting cars starting from bumfuck nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. I was very poor growing up, and I have a history of exotic car ownership, 300 plus cars over the last 20 years. Currently, a $30 million collection owned cash. Started from the bottom, built everything dollar for dollar. And yes, I also leveraged financing at the very beginning where exotic car financing wasn't very popular with banks, all the way to today. Once in a while, still leverage financing, but the majority of times now, I'm buying every single car cash. So as a matter of fact, on my $30 million car collection, for transparency, I have a $600K loan left, which means that there's only one car that has a $600K loan. Every other car is cash. So you could say technically that $29.4 million of my car collection is cash, 600K is financed. Now, so here comes the question. At which point does it make sense to finance? And at which point does it make sense to pay cash? And how can you read wealth ultimately through these mechanisms to know if you're being played by someone or if they truly have a lot of money and are choosing to do that? So there are various stages that a human goes through when it comes to exotic car ownership. Every single person, since I've gone from the very bottom to the very top, I'm gonna give you an example of how people look at exotic car ownership. So they look at it as access. That's the first thing. It's like, how can I gain access to this industry, to these kind of cars so I can fit in, right? This is earlier on when you're somewhat new to the game, you're looking for access. You don't always have money, meaning you don't have a lot of cash, you don't have a lot of ability, so you do what we consider basically a no money down, and you typically do what we consider an average monthly payment, and this is usually based out on something around 60 to 84 months in a conventional bank to start. So this is usually the first kind of like exotic car loan people get. That's why their limitation are usually between 100K to maybe, I don't even want to say 200 because most banks won't do that. I'd say 100K to like 150K at best can kind of fit into this scenario. Like you're trying to get away with low money down, you have an average monthly payment based on a breakdown of 60 to 84 months, and that ultimately gives you access into the industry and to get started. So as you kind of get better, especially if you're using exotic car hack strategies, link in the description if you don't know what I'm talking about. Something that happens here is that at this point, you're not necessarily losing money on the car if you're buying the right cars the way we teach you. You're ultimately building equity in the car instead of negative equity. So this allows you to kind of jump up, and it's very ordinary for exotic car buyers to jump up because we get bored after 6 months to a year. I know many of you guys don't have your first dream car, and when you do, you're like, I'm gonna keep my Porsche forever, I'm gonna keep my Lambo forever. It doesn't work that way. This is like wishful thinking, but once you get in the industry, you kind of understand that like being an owner is very different. So this is like very, very unique. I want you to kind of understand that there's levels to the game. So when you're very new, you typically look at things as a goal and dream. Once you acquire them, its values start to dissipate, so you look at the next step and the next step. And it's very normal for human nature to want more. Don't think of it as greed, it's just the way it works. Only poor people think that greed is a bad thing, that wanting more is stupid. It's because they have nothing, so they don't want anything. So usually if you want more, they're like, you're greedy, you have a lot. Well, you don't have to context to anybody else but yourself, so just focus on that. So in this particular case now here, you have access, that's your first kind of loan. Then comes harder to get financing because it starts to go between 150 and roughly about 400K. This is where you start getting into the larger, like more advanced exotics, like you start wanting to get into the Huracans and the 720Ss, 750Ss, and maybe even early 765s. So you start getting there, and then at this point, usually you need about 20% in most cases of normal conventional financing. You can usually go up to 144 months through a lender, so your payment doesn't change much. You stretch your loan and you have ultimately a little bit more money and cash to put in, and that's the next phase you basically take in your progression of loans, right? So then comes kind of the next stage where you want, 500K cars all the way up to like 1 million. And I say 1 million because the majority of lenders are capped at that unless you get into very creative financing and don't have capital. So you have to start taking on shady loans, et cetera. Once you get past kind of the million mark, if you can't afford to like really put more cash, you're gonna start getting into the scam / weird leasing programs that really are poor financial baselines for any single human. So 500K to 1 million, you start looking at similar terms, 20% down, 144 months, and you start to kind of look at 20% plus, I should say, because any amount over that basically is going to be a down payment. So if you buy a $2 million car, you're going to have to put $1 million down and start looking at financing between that and 144 months. So this is kind of the scale of architecture in the finance world in terms of what a normal conventional person should go through in order to financially be prepared to take on cars at the right scale. And I'm going to tell you why these numbers matter. So no down, 20%, 20%. So the way, I have an extensive background in banking and I've also a net worth of over $100 million. So I don't come to you from a hypothetical standpoint. I come to you from a very technical standpoint. I'm also a Bugatti owner. I have 6 McLarens, 10 Lamborghinis. So like, we're not talking about a guy that's like thinking about what he should do. We're talking about a guy that's telling you exactly what happens. I've also trained over 30,000 people at Exotic Car Hacks on this very same strategy, and it's working, so there's a reason it works. So let's take a second here. No money down, 20%, 20%. The reason this setup is kind of done this way is because most cars here can be bought, you ready for this, where equity has a 5K margin. And this is just the way people don't understand how the financial markets work for cars. So if you're buying an Audi R8, for example, for 150K, and it kind of falls in this category, and you're putting, let's say, 10K down, well, the margin on an R8 V10 Spider is roughly about, or a coupe, is roughly 5 to 10K. So you're buying the margin, and the car itself doesn't fluctuate anymore in value that much for adding a few miles over a year. So the way it basically works is very little down payment will cover your fee of transaction, your shipping, some of this stuff, your baseline and taxes, or if you do Montana, no tax, and so on and so forth. So you're looking at these two things, and you're basically saying, okay, I'm buying the expenditure of the car, but the car's equity itself isn't moving, so it makes sense to basically take out this loan. Now, once you start going into this higher end cars, dealers usually have higher margins, 10% at the very least. On a 400K car, that means they're making about like 30, 40K on the car. So you're pre-buying that margin and the cost of expenditure. The reason this is a good financial process, just so you understand, is because what you're buying, if you're buying the right cars the Exotic Car Hacks way, is you're buying up front the cash basis of the car that could be a negative equity position, and then you're financing the positive equity position of the car. Now, this is very important because then your only real cost of ownership is the interest on that, but that interest is really the same regardless of this 84 or 144 months because you're not going to keep the car that long. So the reason this makes sense, and I just want you to kind of understand that, the reason this really, really makes sense for a lot of people is because if you start to consider how this works, is it never puts you in a significantly heavy negative equity position unless you bought the car wrong and basically gave the dealer all the money. So let's say as of the time of this video, Pista's value is 600K and you ended up paying 750. Okay, well now you have 150K in negative equity right away, and even 20% won't save you. But here's what ends up happening. If the value of the car is going up, it's eventually going to catch its equity up. If the car value is not significantly increasing, most cars do not significantly increase, some cars do, so you're going to start getting shrunk where your actual equity has disappeared into your down payment, and basically you're going to wash away. This is how banks function, and this is how banks want you to function. So now comes the question, what if you have 400K cash? Should you use it in the business or in your personal business? Should you keep it as cash, or should you actually put it in the car? Well, we're going to look at this from a logical standpoint, and I'm going to tell you this is very important because I want you to understand which you should actually take on, because it makes a significant difference. So think about cash this way. There is what we call cost of cash. Okay, this is very, very important. This is two terms you're going to have to understand, and there's also something called parking cash. So these are very, 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 very important things to know. Every single person and human being has basically a function divided between these two things. What is the cost for their cash, and do they have a need to park cash? So typically, if you're a person who needs to park cash, so let's say, for example, I have a business, one of my 10 different businesses has a significant amount of cash flow. So it generates anywhere from $3 to $8 million a year in pure cash, meaning I have no use for that cash. This is supplementary business income. It's not like my primary income. I don't live off of it. I have no debt. So basically, I have a need to park cash, because what am I going to do with all this cash? I don't want to put it all in the market. And so there's a lot of benefit to parking cash, such as tax benefits within your business, at which point it would be stupid for me to take out a loan when I have an excess of cash, nothing to do with that cash, and I can park it. So I can park cash in cars that potentially go very, very high up and give me a return on that cash. So it's almost like a function of a stock market internally of the business, untaxed, that then allows you to make a profit on the money, and then can get even better tax opportunity because of capital gains being shorter in the long term. So as an example, I can get, for example, a 37% tax benefit by parking cash, keeping the asset 2-3 years, and then ultimately having a tax rate of 20% instead of 37%, putting me in a situation where at the time of sale, I've not only made money on the asset, but I'm also taxed at a significantly lower rate. So this is a much better opportunity for someone who has a heavy cash flow position. Now, this is what a lot of people in very late stages of business, when business has done very well, typically do. They need a place to park cash. And so at that point, it no longer makes sense to finance a car. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about an understanding of when it makes sense and why certain influencers finance cars. So there's a couple of reasons why you finance a car where it could make sense. The first one is that you don't have cash, meaning you don't have $3 million, you don't have $2 million, you don't have $1 million in cash. You can substantially do what we just talked about, take 20%, take 10%, take whatever kind of creative financing and go into something. So you're buying access early. That's why it's unproportionally different and broken. So if an influencer is telling you that they had to finance a car for $2 million when they never had a history of other cars they financed and haven't gone up the financial ladder, that immediately tells you that they have no access to lending that will take them there. So basically, they took a very small down payment, took a very high car with a high monthly payment, and put themselves at a significant risk of financial ruin just to have access, like we talked about earlier. And that's very, very dangerous, because when you're gaining access early, you can't afford to. So even though in your head you have the cash to physically gain access, you're not understanding the long-term repercussion of the financial disaster you've created for yourself by going into something where you're constantly in a negative equity position every month with huge amounts of cash going into the proposition. So access, clout, whatever you call it, you're basically getting fucked, completely every single day without paying attention. So what is cost of cash? The way someone determines if they're financially savvy, if they're going to take out a loan or not, is what is their cash worth in the market, and is there actual relevancy to it? So let's say, for example, I would like to build a portfolio of stocks, or I'd like to have some type of money-making opportunity, and the stock market, let's say, pays 15% on average a year. So I say, okay, so this is 15% with my money in, but what is the opportunity if I take out a loan? Well, if I take $500K to use for a car, and I could earn 15% on that $500K, well, I can take out a loan for 8 to 10% on that money. So basically, I'm making 5%, right? That's conventional thinking. That's smart. Hey, I can make 15% with my money, and this is what happens with the money, where I can borrow. Theoretically, this scenario should be the only thing someone uses to determine if they should or shouldn't do that. But don't forget that every single industry has a cap. So you have to be diversified, and nobody uses this scenario in their head saying, well, I can reuse the money in my business. Part of the reason you reuse the money in your business is because your business doesn't produce enough money to support itself. So the first flag is in finance when someone says, the reason why I'm again taking out a loan is because I want to reinvest the money in my business, is because their business doesn't create enough cash flow, so they need that cash to create cash. So the reason this is like a problematic thing is because they're looking at it strictly from the car in a marketing venue. You know, they're saying, I'm paying for this marketing access. Even if they're paying $60,000 a month for a car, in their mind, it's like, this is the same as doing Facebook ads. I'm paying $60K because it's giving me clout to sell more stuff. These strategies are incredibly flawed financially and very, very dangerous for the people doing them. And they just don't realize it because they're usually very young, immature, and have never owned money in the past, so they don't know how to manage it. It's no different than an athlete getting $300 million contract, never having had money before. And what is the first thing they do? They go to advisors of other people that basically charge them huge amounts of fees. And within 6 to 10 years, they've bought a bunch of stuff. They're overbuying based on not their cash flow, but based on their actual dollar in the bank. You see, a smart person does not just get a $300 million contract and go, I can now spend $200 million of that and I'll have $100 million left in the bank. A smart person, like the athletes that become billionaires who end up staying a long time with investments, are individuals who say, first, what portion of the money can I take to create cash flow? Two, how can that cash flow then be used to determine what kind of lifestyle I can live? So you should never live lifestyle off of how much money you have. You should live lifestyle off of how much cash you can create. So often, a lot of times, people don't pay attention to these two different things. So it's no different than me saying, listen, if I have, for example, $100 million in the bank, but I own no assets, well, then I don't have much. Because if you take then me buying a house like most people, me owning a couple of real estate properties, me owning a bunch of cars, that number keeps going down. Now, if on the other side I say, hey, I create $50 million a year in cash, and I'm able to have another $50 million in assets already, that's a very different proposition. It's a very strong financial position. So you have to understand that these things play a significant role in the world of finance. So whenever someone says they have to use the money in your business, it's typically because they lack money in their business, and their business can't get access to lending, so they're highly reliant on cash. So it's the cost of cash for them that's preventing them from paying for something in cash, and in most cases, they don't have all the cash. This is a good example because something recently happened during Monterey Car Week where I am a big fan of this new Gordon Murray L1 or whatever they call it, the new McLaren F1, basically resto mod project he had. Absolutely probably one of the most beautiful cars in the world. 5 cars built, for example, at $15 million a pop. And everybody asked me, when am I ordering one? So the first thing I can acknowledge that that's the most beautiful car in the world I've ever seen, and that I actually have $15 million to actually purchase one. But here's the problem. Just because I have $15 million in my bank account to be able to purchase one does not mean I can afford one. Because to spend $15 million in disposable money to go after a car does not make sense. And to finance a $15 million car does not make sense. So in this particular case, I have to say, regardless of the fact that yes, I can afford something and I want it, perhaps it isn't the right financial decision to own it now, even if it's not an opportunity I'm eligible to own right now. And one of the problems in the internet is that a lot of people want to front like they can afford a lot, but they usually can't. And they're afraid to say that because they're trying to compete all the time and compare themselves to other influencers and other people. So they have to be financially relevant because they're trying to persuade you that they're very, very well off, when in reality, they're only as good as the next month of cash they're making, otherwise they're bankrupt, especially because they don't pay their taxes at the same rate a conventional business does until it catches up with them. That's why you see influencers come and go every few years. Bad financial decisions, no different than athletes. Once they lose their contract, they become irrelevant and disappear. So this is something just to understand. But cost of cash should be as simple as determining what can I make, what can you not, and do I have extra disposable cash to park? If you have disposable cash to park, then you're not borrowing it because you're making the right financial decisions. So the only reason someone borrows cash in order to afford something they typically can't afford is access. Access to that world, access to a world they don't typically belong in. And in some cases, it makes sense. So when does it make sense to actually afford a car, even for access? Simply put, here is the way you have to calculate the situation. If you buy, for example, a $2 million car, this is what you want. We'll use this as an example. a $2 million car, doesn't matter what the MSRP is on the car, that, et cetera. I'm saying the car is worth $2 million, okay? That's what basically the dollar today is on the price asking for this car. You want to decide if you can basically afford this car and the access to it. So the first question you're going to ask yourself is, what kind of lender can I get, and blah, blah, blah. You got to look past that. So first off, have you earned your opportunity to finance a $2 million car? If the answer is no, don't buy it. Work your way from the bottom up, because in the long term, it'll take you 2 years to get here, but it'll be solid when you get here instead of getting access early and going bankrupt doing it. Two, here's what you got to ask yourself. What is the equitable part of this car right now? So what you do is you call a bunch of dealers, for example, and you say, okay, I'm being sold this car for $2 million. So you call another dealer that buys $2 million cars and you say, today, if you were to buy this car, you can go on forums, you can go in my exotic car hacks community and ask this, you can go anywhere you want where people know cars. What is the today value, cash value of that car? Someone says, 1.6 million, buddy. That's what we pay today. You're being sold the car to 2 million. There's a 400K profit margin here, okay? That's what the cost basis is on this car. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, can I afford a 400K loss, period, in my life or business? If you can afford the difference between the cash value of the car today and its dollar you're being sold at, which in this case is 400K as an example, you can actually afford to lose 400K no matter what. This means that if you buy this car at 2 million today and get really like, oh no, I made a mistake, I can't afford my monthly payment, my life went over, you are going to lose 400 grand. So the question is, can you afford that loss? If you can afford that loss, then perhaps we can continue. If this number, whatever this number is, that is 20 grand, 400K, or $10 million, if you cannot afford this number, walk away. Like, this is real practical advice. Walk away, because you're putting yourself in an unnecessarily dangerous position for access. So this is the way you determine if you can afford ownership of a car or not. What is the real loss? Can I afford it? Period. Tomorrow I want to get rid of this car. I made a mistake. I have buyer's remorse. Can I afford a 400K loss? It's not going to change your life to lose 400K? Go for it. Don't worry about it. The second piece you want to ask yourself is the lending I'm getting putting me in a financially good position? So here's the second thing. If you can't afford this as a down payment, which is basically the way you calculate and finance to put your lending from bad debt to good debt, then you shouldn't buy the car. Which means that if you want that $2 million car, and in this particular case, 400K is the loss, it could be 100K maybe the loss, but I'm saying in this case it's 400K, can you afford this as a down payment? If the answer is not, walk away. Because you're now taking on what we consider bad debt in finance, which means that you're taking on negative equity from the very first moment you buy the car. Then what you have to look at is what we call amortization schedules, which I think are so important and people, again, don't understand. So you see, most people look at monthly car payments. They get very confused. They look at this and they say, what can I afford a month? Well, I make 500K a month and I'm getting a 50K car payment. So that's only 10%, so that's great. That's not how this works. So you have to understand, what is the amortization of the loan you're getting and what is the fee schedule? Which means that not only you have this number to worry about, but then the lender that's giving you that big of a loan, ask yourself, where is their financial motivation? What are their fee schedules each month, and how much fee schedule are you losing? So now you go 50K in fees to get that loan, acquisition fee, this fee, that fee. Can you afford that as an extra loss? If the answer is no, that's the wrong loan. Now, the right loan might say, hey, you need $1 million down, so I give you $1 million loan. And you might say, I don't have it, so you gotta walk. So can you afford to lose another 50K? Was it worth it, right? This is disposable money. You make money. How long does it take you to make 450K? You think it's not that long? Great. Take it. It's your money. But remember, this is a loss, pure loss. But then here's the thing. Amortization, which is basically the principal plus interest each and every month. In most conventional loans, you will see less of this and more of this, right? More principal, less interest. That would make sense. However, in the opposite loans, like we talked about in the last video when we talked about creative leasing, creative financing that shouldn't even exist, this is the majority of your payment. So the problem that occurs here is that every month you are paying, for example, 40K a month for this loan, or 50K, or whatever it is that kind of creative financing you did. That is money you're basically pissing away. So if you look at a 1-year ownership status of that car, you've pissed away basically $600K right there in interest / creative financing. You've pissed away this, and you've pissed away that. Now take a look at this. 1 year into a $2 million car financed improperly, you're in $600K, $400K, $50K. That means you've paid 50% of this number, right, in 1 year. But here's the problem. In this exact scenario right here, you have spent $1 million to own a $2 million car, and in your head you think, well, that means I have a $1 million balance. Wrong. You don't have a $1 million balance. Because the real balance you have, and I'm going to tell you how this works, and this is where you get screwed. Remember, this is what we talked about. This was your down payment. This was how much fee structure there was. This was all interest. So technically, after 1 year of paying the total of $1,050,000 towards this $2 million car, you technically still owe 1.6 plus on the car. And you have put yourself in $1 million position. Now I want you to understand this. If you would have used the same scenario and you would have conventionally bought an SVJ for $700 to $800K conventionally with a $200K down payment, that scenario, right? That scenario would have meant that after a whole year of driving, you would still have $800K in your pocket. So you would have lost nothing versus in this scenario, you lost the entire 6, 7, 800K, which means you could have had either an SVGA for free or a very expensive hypercar that you couldn't afford that ended up costing you the price of an SVJ. Now, imagine this. You're paying $60K a month, $50K a month for a car. You could have an SVJ completely paid off. It was yours and the equity still in it at $800K, meaning it's literally sitting. But because people want access to finance, they basically make these bad case scenarios and put themselves in a bad situation. So back to my final point here. The way you can determine if you own a car and if you turn bad debt into good debt is, one, can you actually afford the loss potential between the cost of the car and the actual financial repercussion of the car, okay? Period. Secondly, can you afford the fees as a total loss? So are these things total losses? Can you afford the loss? Two, is the actual interest you're paying here worth what you're getting out of the car? Now, in most cases, is it worth to pay $600, $700K for something? Not at all. No, it's not. And most times, you actually can't afford it. That's why you're, again, pre-buying access. So the only way you can determine good debt versus bad debt is, this is the only question you have to ask yourself. Each payment, am I building equity? That's it. If from the beginning to each payment you're building equity, this is what we call good debt. Because you're parking cash and able to flow through and not just pay the bank to give you access to a loan. If you're in the other situation, it's considered bad debt. So next time you're thinking to yourself, should I finance my car or should I not? Ask yourself, am I in a financial position to put myself in a good equity position and hold good debt? If you're not, reconsider the car you're buying. So don't keep listening to these idiots like Dave Ramsey on the internet that tell you that you need to only own 10% of your income. If you can't afford it cash, you can't afford it. There's a lot of truth that it is okay to take out debt to buy an exotic car, especially if you're buying the right car at the right price and you're doing it the correct way. Through the exotic car hacks methodology, you're not losing money. So it doesn't matter. You're building good debt. But if you're just gaining access because you're young and you just want to front and you're buying stuff that you really can't or shouldn't afford, you're buying bad debt. So I want you to start thinking about this. Can I buy all or any of the negative equity bad position I'm making in cash, and can I afford to lose that? If you can, that's a good sign that you can probably afford what you're buying. Secondly, am I going to miss that money? If you are, then don't buy it and reconsider that. Thirdly, is my position on this asset putting me in a good debt scenario the entire time of the asset? If the question is right, then you do it, because there are sometimes financial benefits to taking out a loan when buying an asset. Some dealers actually give you a better price on the car if you're buying it correctly, if you're lending through them, because they get a percentage kickback for the loan you get at the dealership. So it makes sense for them to offer you that, and it works out quite well. So you could get a benefit, and you could also save your cash and use it, or you may use yourself to float cash. So you might have your business doing fairly well in summer months. You know you're in April, and maybe in 3 months you'll have a large chunk of cash coming in. However, the opportunity to buy your special car is now, or maybe prices are rising and you want to take advantage of this now. You can basically finance that portion that you're scared of and then pay the loan off in a couple of months once you get your money. So there are good opportunities to finance cars. I grew up financing a lot of cars early on that I couldn't afford. When I bought my first Gallardo, when I bought my first R8, I had large monthly payments, but I was buying into the equity of the car. So I understood that I had a down payment ready, I had money put aside for repairs, and more than anything else, I also had the monthly figured out, because every single month I wasn't paying a huge astronomical rate or fees to some dealer or lending program. Instead, I was putting in the equity of the car. So when I sold my car, despite the financial pressure of the monthly payments, I got my money back so I could use it on the next car and have a larger down payment and keep cycling the money again and again and again. And that's what led me from being in a Mercedes E55 to an Evo to some of these cheaper cars into a $30 million car collection with some of the nicest cars in the world. So, you know, this is how the financial models work if you use them properly versus how they work if you use them improperly. So improperly, you'll get more access earlier, you'll go bankrupt doing it, and eventually will just keep losing money and have to produce more cash with nothing to show for it. And that's ultimately the largest issue at hand when it comes to buying stuff that could be in good equity positions, but wanting it early enough and not wanting to earn your right to be lended on. So if you found this useful, please like, of course, turn on notifications and subscribe to this channel. Let me know what you think about this strategy, because this is ultimately the most coherent and well-put strategy that doesn't restrict someone access to their dream car, but also makes them not put themselves in a bad financial position in order to afford it. We'll catch you next time for Exotic Car Hacks.